Hello everybody and welcome to this session. Today we're going to be talking about modern service assurance and best practices for autonomous networks. I'm absolutely delighted for this In Conversation session to be joined with Ian Russ from the CT office of BMC. Ian, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Absolutely delighted to have you. And modern service assurance is something which is, I think, at the top of every service provider's mind, particularly at the moment. And as services and networks are becoming more complex, and we're driving much more automation into the network. Ian, the industry is going through massive change, and networks are becoming more automated and elastic. How is this change really affecting the way in which we deliver service assurance?
That's a great question. So I think, firstly, we start to see, as the network becomes more autonomous, as the network becomes more elastic, we start to see some of the traditional service assurance kind of capabilities like fault management, monitoring, performance management, and some of the remediation activities are starting to come down into the network themselves. So therefore, what is left at the service assurance layer is generally going to be the more complex, the more difficult issues. And I think we end up with three types of kind of issue being managed. Those that cannot be automated, they either don't occur often enough to warrant automation, or when they do occur, they're just too difficult, too complex, too diverse. We end up with a significant volume, I think, in the near term of partial automation issues where the automation has tried to do something, has failed, or has got to a logical sort of stopping point, and therefore somebody needs to pick that up in service assurance. And then thirdly, I think there's going to be the traditional things that can't be automated because they're physical things, like a card failure, and therefore you're going to need to do sort of coordinate a truck roll. I think the challenge is going to be that as the network becomes more automated, more complex, and there are more vendors involved, it's how do you then accelerate that response to those more complex, often more impactful type issues faster. And I think that's something where we need to kind of focus our efforts.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. But when we talk about that, what needs to change though within the operations to ensure better service assurance for those higher, more complex situations that can't be automated?
So I think there's probably sort of a number of things we can look at. First of all, I think the sort of traditional reactive, passive kind of consumer of issues as they arise, I think that needs to change. I think we need to be moving to a much more proactive model where operators are able to kind of get on with other maybe higher value work while they're waiting for something to break potentially. And then they get told at the right time what their next response is. So I would say kind of first focus, greater product sort of proactivity. Secondly, I think improving context and visibility when there is an issue is important. Sort of staring over the shoulders of multiple operators, I recognise that often when there is a significant issue, understanding the root cause, understanding the context and the impact, understanding what actually needs to be done is quite difficult. It often results in lots of swivel chairing, lots of clicking through different systems of information. Being able to pull all that information into a single screen, being able to surface the right information to the operators so they know what to do next if it's not automated, I think is key bit. And I think the third one is, as the network becomes more complicated, there is probably going to be more partners and suppliers involved in that delivery. Therefore, the traditional kind of expert-led model where you have lots of different silos of domain knowledge, I think are going to need to be broken down and have a more generalistic approach where people are going to have more general skills, and that skills need to be then augmented through knowledge pushed to them at the right time. So rather than having a specific specialist in an area, you might have a larger pool of generalists who work on that ticket.
And I want to explore that a little bit more with you. I mean, skills is a big challenge when we think about automation and where we're going. And we see a lot of people a bit nervous and a little bit scared about automation. I'm going to lose my job. But you said something really interesting there about high value impact work. So do you think actually automation gives, employees an opportunity to upskill, to do some more interesting parts of their jobs and focus on high impact issues rather than as opposed to doing very repetitive tasks and looking at screens all day and a bit more mundane?
Oh, I think so. I think we can look at what's happened in the IT industry, where similarly they moved a lot of kind of low value activities being automated out through elasticity or through cloud services. And it's not a case that suddenly people are no longer able to do things. They're much more interested and more motivated in focusing on things which actually move the dial much more significantly. So you can be, rather than kind of passively responding to something, you could be working on either specific spot improvements to a process that you work on, or you can be actually delivering other capabilities to the business. And I think most people come to work to feel that sort of sense of achievement and kind of development. And I think automation is an opportunity in this space. I think people look at it as a threat. In most cases, people's roles will change, but I don't think it's an elimination of role. I think it's actually allowing them to do other more interesting things.
I mean, when we think about automation, it's actually very complex. You can't just come in, buy a system and switch it on overnight. There's lots of integration with many different systems and many different processes. And also one of the big questions that I see asked by service providers today, is where do we get started? What is the best point, for automation? So what do you think of that?
Without being kind of too much of the cliche, I think there's a journey here. So I think there's probably some things you do in the near term, and then there's some things you can probably look at slightly longer term. So near term, I think probably the first two things I would always look at are integrations. Data is probably the number one barrier to automation. You can't automate if you don't have the data. Often sort of data is locked behind multiple silos, and that's partly down to sort of legacy technologies where they just weren't designed to integrate. But there are obviously some of the more modern processes that still have challenges with integration. I think adopting something like the TM Forums ODA or the TM Forums Open API models, which allow you to build those slightly more frictionless integrations, is a great start. It's obviously not the end of the story, but it's a start to it, and I think it builds a foundation for other things. I think there's a significant pool of manual activity still occurring in most of these processes. There are lots of areas where the data is split across lots of systems, or that to get hold of things requires a lot of manual interactions. I think there's those areas that even without sort of widespread automation in the network, you can start tackling. Things like understanding the impact of a failure on the service. That's those kind of things can be automated today. And I think then in slightly longer term, we can start using sort of higher levels of AI and machine learning to kind of further automate these steps through things like using AI to do root cause analysis or scheduling of changes so that you minimize impact on service levels, being able to augment domain knowledge through sort of specific targeted knowledge. And I think it's an area that, there is no defined end point to it, but I think if you can break it up into smaller chunks, the journey doesn't look quite so sort of daunting, maybe.
And Ian, I'd like to pick up on one of those challenges, which you mentioned then. I think this is so important. Automation and AI is only as good as the data, in which you have and which you process. Yeah. How do we fix this data challenge? We've got to get the right data at the right time.
Yeah, and I don't think there's one magic answer here, and I think it's also quite contextually sort of sensitive in terms of different organisations are going to have different data challenges. But broadly, I see two or three key areas to focus on, and it's certainly the things that we're looking at. One is, again, integration, being able to support a more productised set of integrations, being able to standardise on the terms and the data that you're using, so that rather than having lots of very specific, fragile, complex integrations, of building a more open ecosystem for data exchange is probably the first point. I admit it's not necessarily an easy thing to do in most operators. Secondly, I think federation is key here, especially in the operator space where there is so much data. I think traditionally vendors have been guilty of thinking that the best way to improve data is by kind of getting a copy of it yourself and then using that data. And I think from a software engineering perspective, that is obviously quite tempting. It's a lot easier to kind of have your own data set to work with. I actually think that federation is the key here. We need to be better at identifying sources of data and then being able to query them at the right time rather than trying to kind of duplicate multiple data sets, which only leads to further data complexity later on.
No, absolutely. And we obviously talked a lot here about data because, as I said earlier, it's absolutely critical to have the right data in the right time to allow, automation and AI. But the other side of that, particularly when we think about data, is about trust and governance in automation. We need to trust that that it's doing the right things at the right time as well as getting the data. How do you get that right? How do you build in that trust and have the right governance in automation?
So I think there's probably two or three topics here. So the first one is transparency. I think there is, transparency is key to any kind of level of trust. If you don't understand why something is done then there's an implicit kind of lack of trust there. So opaque decision-making engines aren't going to help. So anything around AI, you need to be able to understand not only why the action was, well, the outcome of the action, but you also need to understand why the action was taken in the first place. What were the steps that it did? And actually, you're going to need to probably understand the kind of decision engine that is driving it. So there's kind of a combination of transparency, making that information available to operators and people who consume it so they can understand what was done, or in the case of a partial automation, being able to understand where it failed. Secondly, I think traceability, being able to go all the way back through the steps so that you can understand the root of the kind of automation. What triggered it? What did it look at? Why did it make that decision? What was the learning model that it used? What was the data set that it used to learn against? All of that needs to be surfaced in a way that people can access simply. So that's one half of the equation. I think the other part of the equation is then governance. How do you ensure that as you make improvements to your machine learning environments or your AI engines, that they're introduced in a way that doesn't disrupt the service, that is, again, supportive of traceability, but also isn't overly cumbersome? I think there's a temptation still in a lot of organizations to have a very rigid change process in this space. And I think actually we need to be learning, again, from things like the DevOps space, where they've identified that actually often a slightly more flexible change process results in a higher, more successful change rate. So therefore, being able to kind of build a change model that allows you to accommodate kind of AI, machine learning type capabilities without applying too much control, I think is going to be key here. So it's kind of trust. On one side, display what you've done, and the other side, ensure that you know why you're making changes.
No, absolutely. And that's a big area that we're looking at here at TM Forum as well. We've got our whole AI data governance work stream, which really looks at, standards and best practices in that way. How can we understand what's happening, with that AI and those algorithms? So, Ian, I've got one final question for you. And I think this is, again, something which we're really at the bit that is very nascent. We're starting to look at this. And it's really to understand, how is your relationship changing with what you offer to your customers? Operators of different sizes in different regions are all having very different approaches to automation. Some want to do more than others. Some want to do most of it in-house. Some want to outsource it. But others are really looking increasingly to their vendors for help. What's your stance on this, and what are you doing in that very, changing relationships?
So I think that's a really interesting question, and we see sort of a couple of key sort of movements here. One is that most of our customers are starting to focus on consolidation, standardization of their products. So what was tolerated 3 or 4 years ago in terms of multiple lots of systems, a lot of our customers are saying, no, we want one standardized process, one standardized platform for service assurance. So that's then sort of driving the second behavior we see, which is most of our customers are increasingly expecting a productized solution. I think 5-10 years ago, there was a relative acceptance that you bought something and then you customized it to meet your own objectives. Increasingly, we see customers are actually asking us to deliver a more, 80-20 rule, 80% standardized, 20% customized. Obviously, each of our customers are different, so there is still that need to reflect their specific requirements. But I think there's a kind of common DNA of we want something a bit more standardized. And I think that the sort of third thing that we see is increasingly customers are asking for, standards-driven approaches. We see a lot more customers asking for TM Forum type certifications, being able to kind of prove that we build integrations in a standard way. And I think these all drive towards the kind of topics we've been talking about, which is as the network's becoming more automated, you need to have a more standardized service assurance layer, but we still need to be able to reflect specific local conditions.
Yeah, and I think that's the key role where things like standardization and conformance, really are important. And I think that's what we're going to see much more of as we mature, around AI and automation. Well, Ian, Russ, it's been an absolute pleasure to be in conversation with you today. This is a really critical topic, I know, which many people are trying to address. And to remind people again, TM Forum are doing a lot of work in this area with all of our members. So please come and have a look and come and join us. Well, Ian, Russ, thank you very much, and I hope to speak with you again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.